The temperature inside Thomas Henley's cabin held at 68 degrees, while the blizzard outside dropped to 40 below zero. His neighbors, burning twice as much wood in their standard cabins, shivered at 35 degrees and wondered how the strange chimney with the flat stone cap could possibly work better than their traditional designs. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from, and if frontier ingenuity like this fascinates you, hit that subscribe button. Tomorrow's story might just change how you think about survival. Thomas Henley stood at his window watching thick smoke roll from beneath the flat stone cap of his chimney. The winter of 1842 had brought the coldest temperatures he had seen in 11 years on the frontier. But inside his cabin, the air remained comfortable, almost warm. The fire in his stone hearth burned steadily, not the desperate roaring blaze his neighbors maintained just to keep their families from freezing. He placed his hand against the interior chimney stones. They radiated heat like a cooking stove, warmth that had been building and storing for weeks, releasing gradually into the small space even when the fire burned low. 1 year earlier, Thomas had stood in a different cabin, watching his wife Margaret die from the cold. The memory remained sharp and terrible. It had been late February of 1841, 3 days into a blizzard that dropped temperatures to 30 below zero. They had firewood. They had kept the fire burning constantly, but the cabin could not hold warmth. Their standard stone fireplace and chimney consumed wood at an alarming rate while providing only inconsistent heat. Cold air downdrafts swept through the chimney whenever wind gusted, dropping the interior temperature so rapidly that frost formed on the interior walls despite the roaring fire. Margaret had been sick with fever when the storm began. The temperature fluctuations made everything worse. Thomas had wrapped her in every blanket they owned and fed the fire until his arms ached from splitting wood. It made no difference. The cabin temperature swung wildly between barely tolerable and dangerously cold. On the second night, Margaret's fever broke, but the cabin temperature had dropped again during a particularly vicious downdraft. Her body, weakened by illness, could not recover from the cold shock. She died in his arms on the third morning while the blizzard still raged outside and the fire still burned in the hearth. Thomas buried her when the storm finally cleared. He marked her grave with river stones on the hillside above their homestead. During the burial, he made a decision that would consume the next 9 months of his life. The problem had not been insufficient firewood. The problem had been the cabin's inability to maintain steady warmth. Every frontier cabin he knew had the same weakness. Standard fireplaces and chimneys were fundamentally flawed for extreme cold conditions. Most settlers accepted this as unchangeable reality, the price of frontier life. Thomas could not accept it. Margaret had died with a full woodpile 30 feet from the cabin door. The fuel had been adequate. The structure had failed her. He spent the rest of that winter examining the question obsessively. What made frontier cabins so vulnerable to cold? Why did fires consume enormous amounts of wood while providing inadequate heat? Why did some cabins seem slightly warmer than others? He began paying attention to every detail of cabin construction and fireplace design, searching for patterns that might explain the deadly inconsistency he had experienced. Spring arrived in April of 1841, melting the snow and opening the trails between scattered homesteads. Thomas should have been planting crops and repairing winter damage to his property. Instead, he spent his days walking through the territory, examining abandoned cabins. There were many. Frontier life claimed settlers regularly, and those who survived often moved on after a single brutal winter convinced them they had chosen poorly. Thomas studied the failures with methodical attention. He found a cabin 15 miles north where a family had frozen to death 2 winters earlier despite having adequate firewood stacked outside. The door had been barred from inside. They had simply been unable to keep the cabin warm enough to survive. Thomas examined their fireplace and chimney construction. Standard design. Interior stone fireplace with a chimney that rose through the roof, gaps between the stones where mortar had cracked. The chimney opening was wide, which conventional wisdom said improved draft. Thomas noted everything in a small journal he had begun carrying. Another cabin 10 miles west had been abandoned after the family's youngest child died from cold-related illness. The father had told Thomas the story before leaving the territory. They had burned wood constantly, but could never maintain consistent warmth. Some nights the cabin felt tolerable. Other nights, despite the same fire, brutal cold swept through the space. The father described sudden temperature drops that seemed to come from nowhere, freezing air that poured into the cabin even with the door and windows sealed. Thomas examined this cabin too. He found the same standard construction, the same wide chimney opening, the same reliance on interior placement that every builder used. He visited occupied homesteads and talked to settlers who had survived harsh winters. Most accepted the cold as inevitable. They burned enormous quantities of wood, wore heavy clothing indoors, and hoped their families would survive until spring. But a few offered details that Thomas found significant. Jacob Reinhardt, his nearest neighbor, mentioned that his cabin was coldest during high winds. William Cross, who had built cabins for several families, said downdrafts were the worst problem, cold air rushing down the chimney and into the livings, space overpowering the fire's heat. Patrick Drummond, a Scottish homesteader, described watching his fire nearly go out when wind gusts created reverse draft that pushed smoke back into his cabin along with freezing air. Thomas began to see a pattern. The problem was not just heat loss through walls or roofs, though that occurred. The critical failure point was the chimney itself. Traditional chimney design created a direct pathway for cold air to enter the cabin. When wind blew across the top of a chimney, it could create downdrafts that pushed freezing exterior air straight down into the living space. The wider the chimney opening, the more severe this effect became. And interior chimneys, while seemingly logical for keeping heat inside the structure, wasted the thermal mass of the stones by radiating much of their stored heat into walls that then lost it to the exterior. In June of 1841, Thomas loaded his wagon with the modest yield from his small farm and made the 3-week journey to St. Louis. Most settlers made this trip once or twice a year to sell produce and furs, purchase supplies, and return home as quickly as possible. Thomas had a different plan. He sold his goods for a fair price, then spent the next 2 weeks doing something his fellow frontiersmen would have considered insane. He studied buildings. St. Louis had grown substantially since Thomas had last visited. Brick homes lined established streets. Stone commercial buildings rose 3 stories high. Wealthy merchants lived in houses with multiple fireplaces and sophisticated heating systems. Thomas walked through neighborhoods examining chimneys. He noted their heights, their proportions, their cap designs. Some chimneys had simple brick tops, others featured stone caps that extended beyond the chimney walls. He sketched these in his journal, noting which designs seemed most protected from weather and wind. He spent an entire afternoon watching masons build a bank. The workers were German immigrants, skilled craftsmen who had learned their trade in the old country. Thomas observed how they selected stones, how they mixed mortar, how they created structures that would bear tremendous weight. During a break, he approached the foreman, a thick-shouldered man named Friedrich, who spoke heavily accented English. Thomas asked about stone's properties related to heat. Friedrich seemed surprised by the question, but answered readily. Stone absorbed heat slowly and released it slowly. Dense stone held more heat than porous stone. Thick stone walls could store warmth from the day and release it through the night. Thomas asked about chimney design. Friedrich explained that wealthy European homes often built chimneys with multiple flues, complex smoke chambers, and features designed to prevent downdrafts. He described a technique called a smoke shelf, a horizontal ledge built into the chimney that disrupted downward air currents and reflected heat back into the room. Thomas sketched the concept carefully. Friedrich noticed his intensity and asked why a farmer cared so much about masonry. Thomas explained briefly about his wife, about the cold, about his conviction that better chimney design could save lives. Friedrich nodded slowly. He had seen cold winters in Bavaria. He understood. Over the following days, Thomas visited wealthy homes under the pretense of seeking work as a laborer. He observed their fireplaces from inside. He noticed that the most comfortable homes had massive stone fireplaces with thick walls and restricted openings. The fireplaces were not wide and open like frontier designs. They were carefully proportioned, with fireboxes that seemed almost too small. But the rooms stayed warm with modest fires. The stone masses radiated heat for hours. He examined exterior chimneys on older buildings. Most builders placed chimneys inside walls to keep heat in the structure, but a few exterior chimneys existed on commercial buildings. Thomas noticed these chimneys were built substantially thicker than interior ones. The stone mass was enormous, sometimes 3 or 4 feet across at the base. He reasoned through the logic. Exterior placement meant the stones experienced greater temperature differential between inside surface and outside surface. This differential, combined with massive thermal mass, might actually improve heat retention rather than diminish it. The cold outside would make the warm inside stones hold their heat more efficiently, releasing it gradually rather than quickly. Thomas returned to the frontier in late July of 1841. His wagon carried supplies that made other settlers shake their heads in confusion. Most men returned from St. Louis with basics: flour, salt, coffee, sugar, ammunition, perhaps some cloth or tools. Thomas had spent nearly all his money on 300 pounds of lime for mortar, specialized masonry chisels and hammers he had purchased from Friedrich's supplier, a rope and pulley system designed for lifting heavy stones, and 24 sheets of paper covered in sketches of chimney designs and stone patterns. Jacob Reinhardt was the first to see the wagon's contents. He lived a mile west of Thomas's property and considered himself knowledgeable about frontier construction. He had built his own cabin and helped several neighbors with theirs. When he saw the lime bags and masonry tools, he laughed outright. "Building a monument to your dead wife?" The comment was cruel, but Jacob considered it practical humor. Spending money on fancy stonework when basic survival required constant attention seemed foolish to him. William Cross visited 2 days later. Cross was the closest thing the scattered settlement had to a professional builder. He had constructed 7 cabins in the area and took pride in his efficient methods. He could put up a serviceable cabin in 5 days with 1 helper. When Thomas explained his intention to build a new cabin with an exterior stone chimney, Cross was direct in his criticism. "Exterior chimneys waste heat. Everyone knows that. You put the chimney inside so the stones warm the cabin. Put it outside and you're heating the forest." Thomas tried to explain the thermal mass principle he had learned from Friedrich, but Cross interrupted. "I've built more cabins than you've seen, Henley. Stick with what works." Patrick Drummond, the Scottish homesteader, offered a different concern. It was early August when he stopped by and found Thomas clearing ground for the new cabin site. "You're starting construction now? You should be finishing your harvest and stocking firewood for winter. Building takes time. You'll be caught short when the cold comes." Thomas acknowledged the risk but continued working. He had selected a spot on high ground with southern exposure, positioned so the cabin's gable end would face the prevailing winter winds. This would allow the chimney to shield the main structure while taking the brunt of the wind itself. He spent 2 weeks gathering stones from the creek bed a quarter-mile from his building site. He did not take every stone. He tested each one, looking for specific characteristics: dense river stones that had been shaped smooth by water flow, field stones with flat surfaces that would stack well. He rejected porous stones, irregularly shaped stones, and any stone with visible cracks. His neighbors saw him spending entire days selecting and hauling stones when he should have been preparing for winter. They thought grief had damaged his judgment. Thomas knew exactly what he was doing. The stones would determine everything. Poor stone selection would create a chimney that cracked in temperature extremes, or failed to hold heat efficiently. Proper stones, carefully chosen and properly placed, would create something the frontier had never seen. September arrived with cool nights that reminded Thomas winter would come whether he was ready or not. He began construction on the first day of the month. The foundation was critical. Most frontier cabins had no foundation at all, just logs laid directly on cleared ground. They settled, shifted, and rotted within a few years. Thomas dug a trench 2 feet deep around the perimeter where his chimney would stand. The trench followed the frost line, going deep enough that winter, freezing, and thawing would not shift the structure. He filled the trench with gravel hauled from the creek, creating drainage that would prevent water accumulation and frost heaving. On top of the gravel, he began laying stone. The base of his chimney would be massive, far larger than any standard design. He built it 4 feet wide on each side, creating a square foundation that would support enormous weight. Most chimneys were built narrow to conserve materials and space. Thomas was building his to maximize thermal mass. More stone meant more heat storage capacity. The principle Friedrich had explained was simple. Stone absorbed heat slowly from the fire and smoke passing through the chimney. Once heated, stone released that warmth gradually over many hours. A small chimney held little heat. A massive chimney became a heat battery. He selected the largest river stones for the foundation layer, placing each one carefully and filling gaps with smaller stones and mortar. The lime mortar he had purchased from St. Louis was superior to the mud and clay mixture most settlers used. It would cure hard as rock and withstand the temperature extremes of frontier winters. He mixed it in small batches, keeping the consistency perfect. Too wet, and it would not set properly. Too dry, and it would not bond the stones adequately. Each stone was seated firmly, tapped into place, and mortared with complete coverage. Jacob Reinhardt visited on the 3rd day of construction. The chimney base had risen 2 feet above ground level. It looked absurdly large, a stone platform that seemed designed for a building 10 times the size of a normal cabin. "Building a fortress for smoke?" Jacob asked. Thomas paused from his work and tried to explain. The mass of stone would absorb heat from every fire, storing warmth that would radiate into the cabin for hours after the flames died down. A small chimney lost most of its heat up and out. A large chimney captured and held that heat. Jacob shook his head. "You're making it harder than it needs to be. Chimney just needs to draw smoke. You're building like it's a palace in St. Louis." William Cross stopped by a week later. The base had reached 3 feet in height, and Thomas was preparing to transition to the vertical shaft. Cross examined the work and admitted the stonework was quality, but he remained convinced the entire approach was backwards. Exterior placement is your mistake. All this mass outside means all this heat outside. Interior chimneys keep the warmth in the living space. Thomas pointed out that interior chimneys radiated heat into walls that then lost it to the exterior anyway. The thermal mass worked better with temperature differential. Cross did not understand the concept and did not want to. 20 years from now, you'll realize you built this backwards. Late October brought the first hard frost. Thomas had been working on the chimney for 7 weeks without pause. His harvest had been minimal. His firewood supply was adequate, but not abundant. His neighbors predicted he would regret his obsession when winter arrived and found him unprepared. Thomas continued building. The base of his chimney now stood 3 feet high, a massive square platform 4 feet wide. What came next would distinguish his design from anything the frontier had seen. He began the transition from base to vertical shaft. Most chimneys simply rose straight from foundation to cap with no variation in width. Thomas created a subtle narrowing, a shoulder where the broad base ended and the shaft began. The transition was not dramatic, just a gradual reduction from 4 feet to 2.5 feet over the course of 6 inches in height. This shoulder served multiple purposes that Thomas had calculated carefully. The wide base maximized thermal mass where the chimney connected to the cabin, creating the largest possible heat storage and radiation area at the point where warmth would transfer most directly into the living space. The narrower shaft reduced material requirements at height while maintaining enough thickness to store significant heat throughout the entire structure. The shoulder also created a ledge, a visible architectural feature that would catch snow and rain, protecting the base stones from direct weather exposure. Thomas had observed this detail in some of the better chimneys in St. Louis. The ledge was subtle but functional. He built it with careful attention to the angle, ensuring water would shed away from the cabin wall rather than running down into the joint between chimney and logs. Above the shoulder, the shaft rose straight and true. Thomas used a plumb line to keep it vertical, checking constantly as he added each course of stones. The shaft maintained its 2.5-foot width consistently. He was building it against the cabin's gable end wall, planning the cabin construction around the chimney rather than the reverse. Most builders erected the cabin first and added the chimney as a secondary feature. Thomas understood that the chimney was the primary element. The cabin existed to be warmed by it. He laid each stone with obsessive precision. The shaft required smaller stones than the base, more regular shapes that would stack efficiently at height. He continued rejecting any stone that did not meet his standards. The mortar joints were thin and consistent, minimizing gaps that could allow heat loss or structural weakness. As the shaft rose, he integrated it with the cabin's log wall construction. The interior face of the chimney would form one wall of the cabin. The stones would be exposed inside, their thermal mass radiating directly into the living space. Patrick Drummond stopped by in early November when the shaft had reached 8 feet in height. "Why exterior placement?" he asked. It was a genuine question, not mockery. Thomas explained the principle again. Greater stone mass was possible without consuming interior space. The temperature differential between cold exterior surface and hot interior surface made the thermal mass more effective, not less. The stones would hold heat longer and release it more gradually. Interior chimneys heated quickly, but also lost heat quickly into walls that transferred it outside. This massive exterior design captured heat and held it, radiating inward for hours. The first week of November brought snow flurries and dropping temperatures. Thomas worked faster, knowing he needed to complete the chimney and cabin before serious winter weather made construction impossible. The shaft had reached 14 feet in height, rising 3 feet above where the cabin's roof peak would sit. Now came the element that would define his entire design, the innovation that would make the difference between success and failure, the capstone. Thomas had found the stone in August during his initial gathering trips. It was a massive flat slab of limestone, approximately 5 feet long, 4 feet wide, and a full foot thick. The stone weighed at least 500 pounds, possibly more. It had been lying at the edge of the creek, partially buried. The surface was naturally smooth, worn flat by centuries of water flow before some ancient flood had deposited it on the bank. Thomas had spent 2 days digging it free and another day building a sled to drag it to his construction site. His neighbors had seen him struggling with the enormous stone and assumed he had lost his mind completely. The capstone would serve as a roof over the chimney mouth. Traditional chimneys either ended in simple open tops or had small decorative caps that did nothing functionally. Thomas's design required the cap to be a working element, not decoration. The stone would extend 12 inches beyond the chimney shaft walls on all sides, creating substantial overhang. This overhang would prevent downdrafts from entering the chimney. When wind blew across the top, instead of forcing cold air down into the chimney shaft and cabin, the cap would deflect the wind, Smoke would exit horizontally from beneath the cap's edges before rising into the air. William Cross visited the day Thomas prepared to lift the capstone. He saw the wooden frame and pulley system Thomas had rigged and immediately declared it inadequate. "That stone will break your rigging and probably break your skull when it falls." Thomas had built the frame from the strongest timbers he could find, using principles he had observed at construction sites in St. Louis. The pulley system was rated for 800 pounds. He had tested it with smaller stones. Cross shook his head and left, convinced he would return to find Thomas crushed beneath a fallen slab. The lift took 6 hours. Thomas raised the stone inches at a time, checking the rigging constantly, adjusting the frame as weight shifted. By mid-afternoon, the capstone hung suspended above the chimney shaft. He had built up the top course of stones to create a rim that would support the slab's weight while leaving the central opening clear. The opening was approximately 10 inches in diameter, much smaller than traditional chimney tops. Thomas maneuvered the suspended stone into position, lowering it gradually onto the supporting rim. The frame creaked but held. The stone settled into place with a grinding sound as mortar compressed beneath its weight. When the rigging was finally removed and Thomas stepped back to observe, the chimney looked unlike anything on the frontier. The massive flat cap extended dramatically beyond the shaft, creating the appearance of a roof hovering over the structure. Smoke would exit from the space between the cap's underside and the shaft's rim, a peripheral opening protected from wind and weather. Jacob Reinhardt arrived the next morning, stared at the completed chimney, and said simply, "That is the most foolish hat I have ever seen on a chimney." Mid-November brought serious cold. Thomas worked frantically to complete the cabin around his chimney. The structure was modest, 16 feet by 20 feet, with carefully chinked logs and 2 small windows. The chimney dominated the interior, its stone mass forming the entire gable-end wall. From inside, the stones were fully visible, creating a surface that would radiate heat directly into the living space. Thomas built the firebox with meticulous attention, creating a smoke chamber behind and beneath the capstone that would allow smoke to rise, slow, and exit horizontally from under the cap's edges. On November 18, 1841, Thomas lit the first fire. He had built a modest stack of kindling and small logs in the firebox, nothing excessive. He touched flame to the tinder and watched carefully. Smoke filled the firebox, then began rising into the chamber. For a moment it seemed to stall, and Thomas felt a spike of fear that his calculations had failed. Then the draft established. Smoke began flowing steadily upward and out from beneath the capstone. Within minutes, the cabin air cleared completely. The draw was strong and consistent. Thomas added larger wood to the fire and settled in to observe. The flames burned cleanly, smoke pulling efficiently through the system. He placed his hand against the chimney stones near the firebox. They were cool initially, but within an hour he could feel warmth beginning to penetrate the mass. By evening, the base stones were noticeably hot. The fire had burned down to steady coals. No longer the roaring blaze needed to heat most cabins. The interior temperature felt comfortable. Thomas let the fire die further overnight, maintaining only enough coals to restart easily in the morning. In most cabins, letting a fire die meant waking to frigid air and frost on interior walls. When Thomas woke at dawn, the cabin was still warm. He placed his hand against the chimney stones. They radiated heat like a cook stove, warmth they had absorbed throughout the previous day and were now releasing gradually. The thermal mass was working exactly as he had calculated. He rebuilt the fire and spent the day observing the system's behavior. When wind gusted outside, he watched for downdrafts. None came. The flat capstone deflected wind perfectly, preventing cold air from pushing down into the chimney. The smoke continued exiting smoothly from beneath the cap, regardless of wind direction. By the second night, The stone mass had absorbed even more heat. The cabin maintained steady temperature with a moderate fire that consumed perhaps half the wood a standard cabin would require for equivalent warmth. Thomas stood in the cabin that evening and thought of Margaret. She had died because their cabin could not maintain steady heat despite abundant fuel. This cabin, with its massive stone-capped chimney, held warmth with remarkable efficiency. The innovation had cost him months of labor and most of his money. His neighbors thought him obsessed or insane, but the system worked. The impossible stone cap that Jacob had mocked as a foolish hat was proving to be precisely what Thomas had designed, a heat battery and draft controller that would keep a frontier cabin 30 degrees warmer than standard construction without burning extra wood. January of 1842 brought the worst cold anyone could remember. The temperature dropped to 20 below zero in the first week, then continued falling. By mid-month, it reached 30 below, then 40 below. The cold was absolute, the kind that froze spit before it hit the ground and made trees crack like rifle shots in the night. A massive blizzard struck on January 23rd, burying homesteads under 3 feet of snow and driving temperatures even lower with brutal wind. Samuel Webb lived 4 miles east of Thomas with his wife Catherine and their 3 children. Their cabin was standard construction, built 3 years earlier using conventional methods. Samuel was a competent frontiersman who had survived multiple hard winters. He kept a large woodpile and knew how to maintain fires. But this storm was different. The cold penetrated everything. Samuel burned wood constantly, stoking the fire every hour, keeping flames roaring in their interior stone fireplace. The cabin temperature hovered around 35 degrees. His children huddled under every blanket the family owned, their breath visible in the air. The second night, downdrafts began. Wind gusting across their chimney top created sudden blasts of frigid air that poured down the flue and into the cabin. The temperature dropped to freezing despite the fire. Catherine wrapped the children in buffalo robes and held them close, but their youngest, a girl of 4, began showing signs of dangerous cold. Her lips turned blue. Her shivering became uncontrollable. Samuel fed the fire desperately, burning through wood at an unsustainable rate. Nothing helped. The downdrafts kept coming, erasing any warmth the fire produced. On the 3rd morning, with the storm still raging and his youngest child clearly in danger, Samuel made a desperate decision. He bundled the children in every warm item they had and told Catherine they were going to Thomas Henley's cabin. The journey was brutal. They pushed through waist-deep snow, faces wrapped against wind that felt like knives. Samuel carried his youngest daughter inside his coat. The 4 miles took 3 hours. When they reached Thomas's cabin, Samuel hammered on the door, expecting to find conditions similar to his own. Thomas opened the door in his shirt sleeves. Heat poured out of the cabin interior. Samuel stared in disbelief. Thomas ushered the family inside quickly. The cabin was warm, genuinely warm, warmer than Samuel's cabin had been even in summer. The children stopped shivering within minutes. Catherine unwrapped layers from their youngest and found her color returning. Samuel examined the interior while his family recovered. A moderate fire burned in the stone firebox, nothing like the roaring blaze he had been maintaining. The massive chimney stones radiated heat throughout the space. Thomas explained the system while Samuel touched at the stones, feeling warmth that had been stored for months. The capstone had prevented every downdraft. The thermal mass released heat steadily, regardless of exterior conditions. Samuel had burned twice the wood Thomas had while maintaining half the temperature. The Webb family sheltered with Thomas for 3 days until the storm broke. When they left, Samuel asked detailed questions about the chimney construction. His children had survived because of the stone cap that his neighbors had mocked as foolish engineering. Spring of 1842 arrived with melting snow and returning wildlife. Word of Thomas Henley's chimney spread through the scattered settlements like smoke on the wind. Samuel Webb told everyone who would listen about the cabin that stayed warm during the crisis winter, about the flat stone cap that prevented downdrafts, about children who survived because one man had refused to accept that freezing was inevitable. Patrick Drummond visited Thomas in April and asked for help building a stone-capped chimney. He had mocked the design 6 months earlier. Now he wanted to learn. Thomas spent 2 weeks at Patrick's homestead teaching him the principles: the broad base for thermal mass, the shoulder transition for efficiency, the massive capstone for draft control. Patrick was a quick learner and a skilled mason. His chimney rose through May, and by June he had a functioning system that matched Thomas's design. William Cross came next, humbled by what he had witnessed. The builder who had insisted exterior chimneys wasted heat now requested the same design for his own cabin. Thomas shared everything freely, drawing diagrams and explaining the physics Friedrich had taught him. Within 3 years, 12 homesteads in the territory featured stone-capped chimneys. The distinctive flat caps became landmarks, visible from miles away. Travelers learned to look for them, knowing those cabins would offer genuine warmth and often generous hospitality. The design spread beyond the immediate settlements. Trappers and traders carried descriptions to Montana and Wyoming territories. By 1847, the technique had a name. Settlers called it a Henley chimney, or the capstone method. No formal documentation existed, no published plans. Just knowledge passed from builder to builder and homesteader to homesteader. The practical advantage was measurable. Families who rebuilt using the stone-cap design documented temperature differences of 25 to 30 degrees, compared to their previous cabins using the same amount of firewood or often less. Winter survival rates improved in areas where the design was adopted. Children and elderly settlers who would have been vulnerable in standard cabins survived comfortably in homes with proper thermal mass and draft control. Thomas remarried in 1845, a widow named Sarah, who had lost her husband to a logging accident. They had 3 children over the next 6 years. Thomas worked his land, built furniture, and lived quietly. He never promoted his chimney innovation or sought recognition. When neighbors asked for advice, he provided it freely. When strangers arrived seeking the man who had invented the capstone method, he showed them his chimney and explained the principles, then sent them home to build their own. Thomas Henley died in 1869 at the age of 54. A fever took him quickly despite Sarah's care. His gravestone in the small settlement cemetery mentioned his work as a carpenter and farmer. Nothing about chimneys or innovations, but across 3 territories, over 100 cabins stood with broad-shouldered stone chimneys topped by massive flat caps. Every winter, smoke rolled from beneath those caps, deflecting wind and releasing stored warmth. The legacy was not in words or recognition, but in stone and heat. In families who stayed warm, in children who survived frontier winters because one grieving man had refused to accept that cold was unconquerable.